I want to welcome everyone. It is almost 5 after 12, so I think we should begin the formal portion of this webinar. And I want to introduce myself. I'm Rebecca Harden, faculty at the U of M School for Environment and Sustainability. Here at University of Michigan's SEAS, or UMCs, we have one of the oldest and most vibrant environmental justice fields of specialization for graduate study. And it's my delight today, as a member of that team of faculty, to welcome all of you onto this webinar, our lunchtime lecture series, Justice Agendas for Confronting Environmental Crisis. We are really delighted by the way these webinars have been unfolding week to week, and today's guest, Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome, is going to be one of my favorite yet. It's so exciting to have the energy building week to week with these conversations about how we think about justice agendas in a time of a pandemic and a time of global mounting environmental climate related crisis right here in our own backyards where we live and work, as well as across the world. For those of you interested in these topics on a more sustained basis, please do bear in mind that our school has a certificate program for those enrolled in other schools and programs at the University of Michigan. And that certificate program has an upcoming deadline of April 30. So do let your students and collaborators know that we'll be looking at applications at the end of April to welcome a cohort of certificate students in the coming fall semester here at the UMCs for our Environmental Justice Certificate Program. One of my closest and most cherished colleagues in that program is on the call with me today, as are many of our alumni and former students and current students. So welcome everyone. I want to tell you that the person who's going to be taking us into Jalonne's work today is Tony Reames, my colleague at UMCs, who is something of a Renaissance man. Tony has degrees in both social sciences and engineering. He is someone who has done work both at home in the United States, Kansas City to Detroit, and abroad in Europe. He's a veteran. He's a person who really represents an enormous amount of innovation in the ways we think about environmental justice, in particular towards energy justice, running his lab on urban energy justice here at the UMCs, which is a place of enormous dynamism and generosity in engaging the continuing trends in, disparate access to energy saving technologies, green technologies within US cities, all of which I think is hitting a kind of pivotal moment right now that we'll be talking about today. So Tony, let me just thank you for showing up for us and for Jalonne. I know you two go way back, and we'd love to have you tell our assembled crowd, and it is a big crowd today, a little bit more about Jalonne's work and your sense of where that work fits in these emerging and very exciting fields at this time.
Right. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that introduction. Thank you for your work putting together this great series of lectures during lunchtime, and for leading our environmental justice field of study at SEAS. I'm pretty excited today to welcome Dr. Jalonne White-Newsome to our lecture series. Jalonne and I think first connected about 4 or 5 years ago, working on an NIH project looking at heat warning systems. And we're currently working together on a special issue for Environmental Justice Journal on redefining resilience and equity in a time of climate change. I think when we booked Jalonne, we didn't know that President Biden would be announcing his $2.3 trillion in infrastructure investment plan just yesterday. And I think it comes at a really critical time, right? We saw what happened in Texas. Jalonne will be talking about flooding today, and we know that we're at a critical moment where we really need to rethink what infrastructure is, how we invest in it, how we target communities that have been disinvested, and how the future of our infrastructure can both adapt to and mitigate climate change, and how we move beyond roads and bridges to think about pipes, buildings, energy, broadband. And so I think the conversation that Jalonne will have with us really piggybacks on a lot of action, both at the federal and state level. Many of you may have heard of the Thrive Agenda and the Thrive Act that was just reintroduced in Congress by Michigan's Representative Debbie Dingell and Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey. And Thrive stands for Transform, Heal, and Renew by investing in a vibrant economy. And that's just what Jalonne continues to work on every day. As CEO and founder of Empowering a Green Environment and Economy, which is a strategic consultancy working to transform communities through people-centered solutions. Her expertise crosses the areas of climate change, public health, and racial equity, and she's worked in government, private industry, philanthropy, and academia. She served as the Director of Federal Policy at We Act for Environmental Justice out of New York. And she recently transitioned from the Kresge Foundation, where she was a senior program officer leading the Environments Program portfolio on climate resilience and equitable water systems. She's a multidisciplinarian with degrees in engineering and public health. And she's also a proud Detroiter. So I'm super excited to have her talk to us about her vast experience and her vision for what an equitable transition to a climate just world looks like. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jalonne, and thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Tony. And I'll just interject real briefly while Jalonne gets her screen sharing set up, to say that there are two other individuals on your screens today, for those of you looking at us in gallery view. That's Jordan James Larson and Lauren Paige Balotin, both of whom are graduate students here at the UMSEAS. Every week, we have students who take a deeper dive into the work and legacies of our speakers and engage with them at the close of their talk in order to segue into a more open question and answer. So I want you to know that they're here waiting in the wings. Jordan himself, someone who has worked for years in Detroit on the very issues Tony just mentioned and that Jalonne will be talking about, and is writing a thesis in part involving some of the urban heat mapping work underway right now, looking at these issues and creating teaching tools about the histories of redlining in Detroit in ways that intersect beautifully with the topics on the table today. Lauren Balotin is sitting, I think, in Atlanta, Georgia today, but working in climate justice issues, doing a dual degree, following in the footsteps of Jalonne in both public health and environment and sustainability, interested in climate justice on the international scale. So we'll look forward to comments from the two of them coming in after the talk. And I want to encourage all of you to use your Q&A and your chat features both as the talk unfolds. Feel free, as you see and hear interesting things from Jalonne, to register your responses and your questions as we go. Jordan, Lauren, and I will be serving as a team in the background, doing that triage and making sure that your questions and concerns get addressed. Jalonne, to you.
I don't think we can hear you, Jalonne.
I'm sorry, I'm on mute. All right.
There you go.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome, awesome. So I was just saying, my internet is acting a little bit unstable. So Rebecca, I just shared with you my slides via email just in case something happens. And I just called in, so we should be good. I mean, you know, it's April and it's snowing, so you never know what's going to happen. So thank you all in advance for your patience. First of all, I just want to appreciate Dr. Hardin for the invitation to come and have a conversation with you all today. Dr. Reames, you know, I think you're awesome, and it's been wonderful to connect and learn more about your work over these last several years. And I cannot not acknowledge, which I think I saw, my advisor, mentor, and friend, Dr. Marie O'Neill, who got me through my doctorate at the School of Public Health, and my colleague Karina, and maybe some other folks that, again, were so instrumental in just being supportive during that time. So much appreciation to University of Michigan. And I don't know if you can see, I have my SPH 75th year anniversary shirt on, so I'm not down dressing for the occasion, just trying to show some U of M pride. But let's go ahead and get started. So, you know, I really hope this will be more of a conversation and really a story. I want to first start out by really acknowledging where I'm calling from, here in West Bloomfield from my home. And I would say that I started really appreciating the purpose of acknowledgement from a mentor of mine, Mama Lila Cabell, who some of you might know, a fierce water warrior in Detroit that passed a couple years ago. But she was the one that taught me the importance of acknowledging where you're from, whose land you're sitting on and the importance of connecting whatever you do with the resources that we have been given to steward, whether it be water, land, or air. So this is where I start. And what you will hopefully see over the next couple minutes is that really, my story is based on my context, where I grew up, and some of the experiences that have gone through my life. So the title of Flooding Streets and Failing Infrastructure, you will soon see that I'm probably going to be talking about a little bit more than flooding. And I mean a little bit more beyond the typical definition of infrastructure. So let's dig in. So I think it's important for you to understand my point of view of the world. And my point of view was shaped by where I grew up. I was actually born in Lima, Ohio, but spent most of my growing years in Detroit, Michigan on the west side and then later on the east side. But during high school, I had the opportunity to be a part of a Touch Tech mentoring program. They were trying to diversify the number of engineers that were going into Dow Chemical and other companies, particularly in chemical engineering. And while I spent several summers in Midland, worried about understanding chemical processes and mass balances and all this great stuff, I ended up learning more about the importance of people. What I learned is that, again, working on the chemical side and knowing that there were these big trucks and tankers going through communities on rail lines carrying pretty hazardous stuff, part of my work was to explore what happened when these tankers and trucks carting these dangerous chemicals were going through communities, and why was the propensity of accidents and spills happening in low-income communities and communities of color. So this is when I really started to understand that there's a meaning to living on the other side of the tracks and how that impacts your health and your well-being and sometimes your life. And so, it took Midland to kind of start that conversation. But then I realized that right in my community, in the places where I grew up, there were some issues going on. So the second picture is of my home church, New Bethel Baptist Church on the northwest side of Detroit. And this is the home of Aretha Franklin, her former church where she grew up. But I bring this up because this community, again, prominent in the civil rights movement, also was prominent in the number of babies that were being exposed to lead. So my family always had daycare centers, one at the church, and my mom, would say, I just wonder why our babies are being more exposed to lead than others, and why the parents are still feeling the exposures from lead and the ramification that puts on, families being able to go forth and work and live. And again, it was just like, why in this community and why our Black and brown babies? But also, even a little bit farther from there was the fact that, this was kind of the grocery stores that were available in that community. And my great aunt, who was 103 years old, she'll be 104 this year, still lives by herself. And I would often, have to go grocery shopping for her. But I would find I'd have to drive like 10 or 15 miles to get to a decent grocery store that didn't have yellowed meat or wilted vegetables. And so when you think about all these different components that were right in my face that speak to environmental injustice and disparities, it wasn't, a far stretch that when I went on to Northwestern University in Chicago, that as a part of my dual degree in chemical engineering and journalism, my focus was environmental racism. And I actually had the first article in our daily paper, the Northwestern Daily, printed around this concept of environmental justice that, again, had never happened. And so my conversation with the People for Community Resource Recovery on the south side of Chicago and Ms. Hazel Johnson really, again, shaped my perspective about, I don't care if I'm an engineer or whatever, we need to make sure that we keep people and justice at the forefront of whatever we do, particularly in my work. And so, again, this went on to really, I would say, embellish itself in my life, because I came back to Detroit, and at that time, my grandparents were in their 80s and 90s, and I was their primary caregiver. And, it started getting kind of hot in Detroit, or maybe we just started realizing that extreme heat and heat waves were happening more frequently and more intensely. But I realized this because my grandparents were feeling it. They spent most of their time in their home, And, I was trying to figure out, okay, what are the resources and the places and people that can help us not only weatherize their home, but help with their energy bills, and their neighbors down the street were having issues with their air conditioning, but couldn't pay for it because they were on a limited income, all these different things. So I started really asking these questions, which led to my dissertation research around climate change health and our vulnerable populations. But not just, again, pinning the vulnerability on the people, but really understanding that the systems that were in place were actually making them more vulnerable. And so a part of this exploration, again, with the help of Dr. Marie and Karina and my wonderful committee, was really understanding from a scientific basis, what was the urban heat island situation? Why were certain places hotter than others? What was like this difference between the ambient temperatures and the indoor temperatures, where sometimes temperatures within the homes across the study were getting into the low 90s and mid 90s? And then more importantly, what were the behaviors that people could take on to help protect themselves and really, get rid of this unnecessary way of dying because of heat? And so again, understanding the fallacies in this infrastructure, the infrastructure that was supposed to take care of people like my grandparents, houseless people, and others, it just wasn't there. It was failing. And so after leaving Detroit, I had an opportunity to do a postdoc at the Union of Concerned Scientists, where I was able to continue my research, but again, get more into this kind of infrastructure issue. Like, okay, we have health departments that are positioned in communities to be, in some cases, frontline responders. But why wasn't the response happening? And it wasn't just in Detroit, but it was everywhere. And some of the high-level findings was essentially that there wasn't a lot of planning going on. Extreme heat was, in most cases, an afterthought. There were limited resources to really dig into this issue. The folks that needed to be communicated to and reached out to were being missed, some of our most vulnerable populations. And again, we didn't know what was working. So where you had your Phoenixes and Phillies and that were kind of engaged in these like innovative adaptation practices to manage extreme heat, there wasn't really anything that codified what worked and what didn't, and how you passed on those things that could, again, help build up the infrastructure in other places. So again, building on the research, but then translating that into policy, which is super important. As Dr. Tony talked about, like, we're in an exciting time right now. And back then in the Obama days, I had the opportunity to be the director of federal policy for an environmental justice organization. And I led the first EJ office in DC. And our job was to figure out, again, how do we begin to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change? And what was beautiful is that it was a collaboration and voices across the country that helped build a platform and agenda and an advocacy space around climate change and mitigation and reducing pollution and adaptation and what that took. But again, even with this policy infrastructure that communities had developed and laid out, we still didn't see the impacts on the ground. And I've also put a picture of my daughters here because, again, as you talk about the infrastructure, it's not just me and the folks that were part of this National Environmental Justice Forum on climate change, but it's also building the infrastructure for the future. So I'm really big into supporting our kids in intergenerational learning and advocacy, because, again, we all know that what we do now is going to impact the generations to come. So again, failing infrastructure, we often think of pipes and buildings and homes, and that's legitimate because that's failing. We know that. But I think some of the other infrastructures that we miss that are just as important in developing and recognizing the failures or fractures are the social networks that we depend on or communities depend on. The health infrastructure, which we've seen blatantly in terms of COVID testing and COVID vaccination and how that fails in communities of color. The policy infrastructure is only as good as if it's actually implemented. The accountability infrastructure in many sectors does not exist, and I invite you to push back on that. The financial infrastructure to actually be able to get money into places that can absorb different forms of capital and actually make change. You know, all these infrastructures are just as important, but again, they invite vulnerability because of their continual failure. So I believe that this just doesn't happen. It is linked to racism. And there's different dimensions of racism, but what I've been focusing on lately are the institutional pieces and the structural pieces. So how do these big institutions function and use their power to either help or harm the communities that they are tasked to serve? And, you know, I just don't say this just to, you know, for the fun of it. I say it from experience. And I wanted to just share some ways that I've seen institutional racism play out. And I encourage you to throw some things in the chat as well. Again, I spent probably 10 years working in chemical manufacturing across this country. And it never failed that the profit or what we were producing really came at the expense of the people. In state government, I was in a situation where we were trying to figure out, well, why are these certain communities, you know, experiencing, you know, a wider range of health disparities? Well, part of the reason is that the monitoring is missing from the places where you need to be tracking air pollution and other pollutants. And so when you have missing monitors or no monitors at all, particularly in low-income communities, communities of color, or places where there's major GHG emission sources, what do you expect? In academia, we see the power hierarchies that exist. Again, what research is considered seminal versus other research? You know, philanthropy, again, appreciate philanthropy, but what are the sources of funds that make these philanthropies run? And are they really serving humankind? Social investments. I've done some work with grant capital and program-related investments and market rate investments and trying to, again, circumvent these things towards the mission of an organization. And oftentimes when you're trying to get investors to invest in climate mitigation and climate adaptation, you know, it's often the question of, well, how am I going to get paid back for this versus the progress that can come from investing in a community that's not able to get a certain bond rating and get funds to rebuild their water infrastructure, just as an example. Research funding. Again, most of you are probably more steeped in academia than I am, but I have the opportunity to sit on an NEIHS board, advisory council. Let me just get the acronym right for, the National Academies. And what's really, again, which is not rocket science, but it depends on who's actually scoring these applications for funding, whether they're R01s or whatever. And I'm learning more about that process and the disparities that play out because of that. Community-based organizations, having been with one and having seen it and with my own eyes, you know, the competitiveness, I call it the competitiveness for crumbs, because essentially there's organizations that are mainstream, mostly white, that have historically gotten more funding and resources, while the CBOs and your environmental justice organizations are just fighting for what's left over. And that's not right. And then last but not least, the institutional racism in really understanding what science is valued. Is it your traditional quantitative, or is that less of importance than community science or indigenous wisdom? So again, this is just from my experience again, as to how I've seen this institutional racism play out. And I think it's really important that you begin to recognize how it's playing out in the places where you are so we can actually address it. So what does all this have to do with flooding? And I will say this picture is of an organization that I used to support through grant funding, and I still love, called Anthropocene Alliance. They're based in Chicago, but they have 50 or so flood survivor groups across the country that are doing amazing work. I encourage you to check them out. But again, you know, my life does not take me far away from what I'm working on. My professional and personal life seem to always intersect. And so a couple years ago, my mom and stepdad decided to downsize and move into a little home on the east side of Detroit. And unfortunately, in those past couple years, they have had to experience 5 feet of water in their basement, some sewage, some rainwater, some fresh water. And this has been traumatic. They're in their 70s, and the fact of everything that they've gone through, not only just the loss of stuff, but just the fact that the mental stress the fact that it's been recurring in a couple years. Their last flood was the week before Christmas. So the notion of being displaced during the holiday, and again, losing things that you can't replace, pictures and family Bibles and things of that nature. And so I appreciate Brenton Mock, who is a colleague and friend, just illuminating through this article, flood victims, not blaming the climate, but blaming the city. And again, it goes back to this theme of infrastructure or failed infrastructure. So this is, again, interesting to me because at the Kresge Foundation, I worked on water for the past 5 years, but I was also working on water issues when I got out of college, writing stormwater permits for different facilities across the country. But what's particularly concerning about this case is that it's not just my parents that have been experiencing water issues, but it is Detroiters everywhere in all aspects of the neighborhoods that are not only experiencing flooding concerns, but of course the water shutoffs. I probably don't even need to tell you that. But again, all these different pieces. And so when I think about the failing of the infrastructure and how it hurts people and harms people, this whole notion of accountability and the fact that we've had conversations, multiple conversations over the past couple of years with the city and how they've basically placed the blame on my parents and some of the other residents. They're to blame for the flooding that occurred in their home. Another troubling concern is the fact that when a flood happens, it's not that the impacts are over. If you don't clean up that basement properly, do the proper remediation, black mold and other things can develop and grow. And so there's really no guidance or support as to when your home is safe to move back into. And again, I often want to challenge, and I have had this conversation, the health department in terms of, what should be your role? If this is a climate impact that you're seeing over and over again, there needs to be a role for the health department for some guidance and support for these folks that want to get back into their home, but might not know when it's the right time or when it's not going to be hazardous to their health, literally. Another situation that, again, as we talk about institutions, is the immunity for utilities. So I don't know if you know, and again, I'm not a lawyer, but I've pretended to be one in many cases, is that utilities and regional authorities have immunity. So if a flood happens and the folks that have been impacted cannot prove 51% causation that the utility or the regional water utility was at fault for the flooding, then the utility doesn't have to do anything. So that total loss is on the folks that have already been impacted by the flooding. Now, can you say policies that need to change? The claims process, again, an institutional thing. When something happens, fill out a claim. Well, I'm sure most of you understand, even with the complaints from FEMA over the years, from Katrina and everything else, that they really don't. And when I say they, the city and those that are a part of a claims process that receive these claims from Detroiters and other places, they don't make the process clear or easy. And particularly in my parents' case, we had to have multiple conversations, multiple filings. And for a person that is not computer literate, does not understand the process, and by the way, might not even speak English, might not be their dominant language, it could be hard to navigate. And that is a huge barrier and an institutional barrier that could easily be remedied. Flood insurance, who has it and who doesn't? Huge, right? And then the obvious disparities that we see between how institutions respond to certain areas versus others. So the residents of Grosse Pointe and the Points definitely had a different response, a different set of prevention tactics in place to manage flooding versus the folks on the east side of Detroit, including my parents' neighborhood and the Chalmers. So I hope that gives you a sense of, again, the failings and needed related to flooding around infrastructure. So I've written about this, and really, when I think about the opportunity with this new administration at the federal level, that is awesome. But again, it's the institutional racism plus some other things that make this complex. So I've talked about the lack of accountability, The fact that when these solutions or whatever happens, people are left out of the equation. They're so stuck to the process. The fact that folks don't really get into what is the root cause of the problem. And then oftentimes, which frustrates me, is that the people are often blamed versus the system. So you're trying to fix the people and they're not broke, but it is the system that is broken and continues to fail. And, you know, all this stuff, and that's just the physical stuff that's happening, right? But we know that the physical manifestations of climate impacts really impact the mental health and the health of communities. So when you talk about the loss of stuff, whether it be your home or stuff in your home, the fact that you can't get any relief or recovery from fighting a system that doesn't seem to be fighting for you, the stress that causes in terms of loss of income, and in my parents' case, the health issues that occurred that kept my mom from working, and all these different things. So we have to look at the big picture. So it's not just the immediate failing of the infrastructure, it's the failing of the community that comes into play because of institutional racism and those other factors. And this is not, again, something that is anecdotal. The national academies and other folks have studied this. And I just want to, point out that, these characteristics of folks that are socially vulnerable to floods pretty much mirror every other thing you can think of, whether it's those that are impacted by COVID, whether it's those that are impacted by heat, whether it's those that were living in red line areas. Again, not totally, but I guarantee that that's a high majority, that this list of folks that are vulnerable, again, parallels what we see in other aspects of our life, unfortunately. And dear colleague, Natalie Sampson and some other folks have, again, begin to document the narrative stories of folks in Detroit that have experienced flooding. And what I want to just really, amplify is that it is preventable. But when we think about from a health perspective and a justice perspective, the trauma that's associated with flooding, the fact that it recurs, that the relief programs don't provide relief, and then the lack of interagency accountability is critical. Again, the failing of an infrastructure. So I'm not just going to harp on the problem, but what I will say is a part of my work in my previous position was to try and transform these systems and the people that have the power to transform these systems to understand that in order for us to have a resilient community, part of that is building climate resilient and equitable water systems. And so a part of my grant making initiative, an initiative I developed at the Kresge Foundation, was to try and do just that. Bring all these leaders together from community-based organizations to water utilities to really increase understanding and efficacy around what equity means in the water space, and then how that translates into how and what you do and the decisions you make at all levels. And so part of that was really defining the problem. There was no definition of water equity, 6 or 7 years ago. So working with organizations like the U.S. Water Alliance and others really helped define what water equity meant. And I think that's super important, particularly for institutions that are trying to change but don't really understand what this equity thing means, right? The second organization I want to highlight was Groundwork USA, and they are doing a fabulous job with their Climate Safe Neighborhoods initiative. And what's cool about it is that they are bringing in the historical context of redlining with where they're seeing more floods and more heat. And so again, there's these overlaying impacts that are related to institutional stuff, policies of the past, that is making it worse for communities to survive and thrive right now. Advocacy, particularly around federal policy and state policy, is critical. And I was able to, again, co-create this Water Equity Climate Resilience Caucus because, in my mind, the voices that were being heard were not the voices of the low-income communities and communities of color that know what they need, but it wasn't being translated into the policy, particularly around water. And so I just want to celebrate and uplift both Policy Link and the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy and the 90-plus organizations that have really built this caucus and continue to be a primary voice on the federal and state level to this day. And we can't talk about all this infrastructure stuff without money, right? Our current president just talked about, I guess, $2 trillion, which is a number I can't even think about. But, you know, how we pay for it is critical. And I think one of the awesome opportunities was to figure out, how do we create this partnership that can begin to fill in these financial gaps? And one of the ways was through a resilience fund that's run through the National Fish and Wildlife Federation, and particularly in Southeast Michigan, around green stormwater infrastructure and habitat conservation and things of that nature. But we focused on GSI as one of those ways to, again, enhance public-private partnerships and, again, infuse equity principles into how we gave the money, but also who is going to benefit. So again, how do we begin to build that financial infrastructure that is responsive to the folks that are most in need? So how do we begin to address failing infrastructure and achieve climate justice? Well, we need to begin to create intersectional platforms that include the agendas of communities. Organizations need to begin their own equity analysis. And the thing that I'm big on is accountability. Like, there are so many sectors that have no accountability. How do we begin to create the metrics and the incentives or the disincentives for folks to, in my own words, get right? I also think it takes good leadership, which is what we're seeing at the federal level. It takes humility. Institutions have to, again, take a step back and understand, yeah, they might have caused some harm, so how can we work better? And then this word that I've made up, implementability. Basically, you know, how are we actually going to make what you're talking about, this higher level, again, reach the states and the localities, which I think is going to be the biggest barrier for this administration. Not an uncrossable barrier, but something that we need to pay close attention to. And I definitely want to shout out congrats to Professor White for being a part of the White House's EJ Task Force. That's awesome. So there's also a chapter that I wrote with a co-author of mine around advancing equitable climate planning, and it'll be coming out shortly. But looking at the promising practices that I've seen, again, across the country, and what are those 7 practices that it takes to really, again, break these institutional barriers and get to some planning protection that will actually serve the communities that we're supposed to. So as a research scholar or emerging researchers or postdocs or whomever is on this call, there's a couple things that I often say we can all do, and it is kind of framed in this word adapt. So acknowledging the harm that we've done or our organization, demanding accountability, addressing racism, power, and privilege, prioritizing equity, and of course, transforming systems. Again, so adapting in this love and not fear of what we might lose is how we're going to get to addressing the impacts of climate change. And so I'm excited as I start this new phase of my life as of about 35 days ago, transitioning to the founder of my own consulting practice. And the mission, and again, which has kind of been a mission throughout my entire life, but now it's just codified, but really focusing on transforming communities and environments through people-centered solutions. And so what I've been doing is working with international governmental agencies, the state of Michigan, professional networks, nonprofits that are really interested in kind of saying, hey, how can we transform what we're doing in policy and practice to better meet the needs of the community? And then how do we actually track that progress? So I'm excited about the work that I'm doing now in the variety, and know that if we're really going to begin to fix our failing infrastructure, it starts with addressing institutional racism and, again, taking a long, hard look at what we're doing and how we can do it better. So with that, I want to thank you for your time. Sorry if I've gone a little bit over, but I get excited about this stuff, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jalonne, for your really informative and thoughtful presentations. So I would encourage anyone who has questions for Jalonne to go ahead and add those into the chat or the Q&A feature at the bottom of the page, and to go ahead and drop those in as we talk about this. So Jalonne, thank you again for starting us out by recognizing the history of this land. The University of Michigan exists on land that it took away from the Council of the Three Fires, an alliance of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, together known as the Anishinaabe. When the colonists officially took the land in 1817 during the Treaty of Fort Meigs, they agreed to provide higher education for Indigenous youth, and that's an agreement that the University of Michigan is still not honoring centuries later. Although this land acknowledgement does not and cannot reconcile the past, it should remind us all that we must change our actions going forward. So as has been mentioned earlier in this speaker series, we open our questions and answers with this acknowledgement so that it won't be something that we just say in passing, but instead the acknowledgement is meant to be a reminder of actions that we should be taking in our daily lives to learn to be better. So as we discuss the systemic racism that Jalonne has been speaking about in her presentation, we hope that you'll all keep in mind the exploitation that we need to prevent going forward. So one particularly important lesson that I know I took away from reading Jalonne's recent work, which I know Jordan and Sarah were sharing in the chat feature, is that resilience isn't just about being able to bounce back after struggle and learning how to deal with that failing infrastructure, but instead being able to address the structural injustices to prevent them from occurring again in the future. So Jalonne brought up several examples of structural racism in her talk, but I'm sure we've all seen it in our own communities as well. I know I've seen it in my hometown of Atlanta growing up and also just recently. So these past few months have really shed extra light on how certain communities are especially at risk due to these structural inequities, and we need to rethink how we are addressing the root of these issues rather than allowing the cycle to keep persisting over and over again. So thank you again, Jalonne, and I'm going to hand it over now to my colleague, Jordan, who is going to add a few thoughts and get started with the questions.
Yeah, thank you, Lauren. And first off, I'll just start off by saying, Jalonne, it's fantastic to have you here, and especially given that I am working on a thesis related to heat mapping and heat stress, it's really exciting for me, at least personally, to have one of the authors of papers I've been reading and citing, and someone that's also very much engaged in work in Detroit come speak with us. So fantastic to have you here, and great to have this conversation. And we were initially thinking that we would start this Q&A off asking you to share a little bit of your own sort of personal story and background and how you got into this work, but you already perfectly included that into your presentation. And so I just wanted to say that I appreciate that sort of personal touch in the story that gets added, because I think that's really critical to understanding the work that we do. And so moving on to the next question that we wanted to ask, and we'll go through just a couple of questions we prepared ahead of time and then launch into some of the questions that our participants added in the Q&A. And so if I first wanted to just say that I find your work and career trajectory to be particularly inspiring. And I think a lot of graduate students and peers of mine would agree with me about that. And there is this sort of normative belief that as master's students, we need to pick one of two broad yet distinct career pathways. One, which is, entering the job market as some sort of professional practitioner right after graduating, and the other is pursuing a PhD and a career within academia. However, your work is pretty refreshing as a reminder that it's not necessarily an either or. And you have worked in a remarkably wide array of sectors, from state government to philanthropy and the private sector, in addition to the more sort of traditional academic work, publishing research and working as an adjunct professor. So to actually get to my question, I'm curious if you could just speak a little bit on how you chose and then have since navigated between your work as a practitioner and an academic, and how you sort of see those distinctions. And particularly within the context of environmental justice work, do you think pursuing and having a PhD has sort of helped your ability to cross academic and professional sectors? And has that made you more effective as an advocate and driver for change rather than just focusing on one or the other? Oh, if you could unmute yourself again, sorry.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, it's like dogs and pets, and I don't want you all to hear anything. So first of all, I am looking forward to seeing your work and learning more about what you're doing. So we will have to connect after this. And I appreciate that question because I have never really been traditional in anything. And so I think, you know, one of the beauties of getting the PhD was that it one, as a woman of color and a woman of color scientist, it did give me more credibility. And one of my mentors, you know, when I was working in industry and I, again, had plans on staying in industry for like 30 years and retiring, which didn't happen, you know, told me that, you know, the PhD will just kind of heighten your level of analysis, and it will just give you that extra thing in your toolbox. So regardless if you go to academia or whatever you decide to do, it cannot hurt. And I took that to heart. But what was cool about it was that I have really never taken on anything just for the fun of it or just to kind of get another degree, you know, whatever. Like it really had to align with, and I make it my own. And so as you can even, you know, imagine with my dissertation, you know, that's a huge investment, even with the master's thesis. So, you know, was there something that, you know, that I could embed my passion in, but could also be useful to the broader world? And so I think as, you know, whether you're a master's student or whether you're kind of exploring the PhD or you're on the PhD track, particularly as you think about the areas of justice and really the applicability of what you're doing to help transform or inform advocacy or support the work of communities or, you know, again, answer a question that they have through your work, I think that makes it even more meaningful. And so I was always, you know, I tried to be very intentional even in my PhD days, but also I try and be very intentional now about really understanding, like, what are the questions? What are the things that people need to know to make smart decisions? And so I think, you know, this whole notion of kind of like academic and kind of practitioner work, it's been kind of like a natural, I don't know, like just a natural flow for me, because I don't think I could be a good practitioner without understanding the academic piece. And I don't think I could be a good academic without understanding the practitioner piece. And when, you know, I've had the opportunity to teach for the past 10 years at George Washington University. And I think, you know, book theory is great, but one of the things that my students continually say that they appreciate is the way that I'm able to make it real and kind of manifest, you know, yes, we talk about the criteria pollutants and GHG emissions and kind of the science behind climate change, but what does that really mean? And why is it so important that we understand that as emerging public health practitioners? So I think, again, it's just been a blessing to have this kind of circuitous path that I would have never imagined. But, you know, I would say, as you think about whether you're a master's student or a PhD or thinking about a postdoc, you know, you don't have to, particularly now, you don't have to go the traditional route. I would say, again, follow your passion and opportunities will open up for you. And that seems really weird and like corny, but I think I have really never had to look for a job because things have opened up. And it's been amazing. So I would say, again, follow your passion, you know, whether it's PhD, postdoc, you know, academia works for some folks and for others it doesn't, you know, but even if you're in academia, you know, there's so many great examples of folks that are like, you know, I call it my, I think, what was my word, like academic advocates or whatever, like Dr. Reames and others. So you can make it work. Like it is not, you know, that's the beauty of it. You create your own thing that you want to do. Recreate yourself. So don't be beholden to what folks think you should do or what the path has already been. So, and that's what keeps it exciting and fun.
Thank you for that reflection and the advice. It's encouraging and great to hear. Right before we just jump into a couple more questions that are popping up in the Q&A, we're getting some active participation, which is fantastic. Continue to put your questions in there if you have them. Just one more that I wanted to ask, and I wanted to connect it back to the very beginning of your presentation when you said that people need to be at the forefront of our work and everything we do. And I think that's such an important statement. And at least within our academic program here at UMSEAS, within the environmental justice community, there's definitely this push and concept that we need to be embedded in community. We need that work that we do to be informed by community and work with community. But in practice, the institutional setting that we find ourselves in does not provide many opportunities to actually help facilitate engaging in that and actually gain practice in that. And so from the work you've done that obviously involves a ton of community partnerships and community work, it would be really great if you could speak a little bit toward what you see as some of the best practices or advice for those that want to do some research scholarship, research activism, some sort of research through this academic lens that also pushes for equity and community justice.
Yeah, I mean, I would say of many schools, I don't know, I think in many ways, University of Michigan does pretty well in terms of kind of community-based participatory research or community-informed research compared to other institutions. I mean, there's always opportunities for improvement, but what I will say, and I want to give credit to Dana Thomas in the School of Public Health. I think she's still in the School of Public Health Office of Practice, because really at the start of my academic career at UMSEAS, I asked her, like, okay, this is what I'm thinking about doing, but are there any institutions or organizations that, need some help or that I could help? And so because she was connected and could kind of point me in the right direction, and at the same time, I was having these issues with my grandparents and already kind of talking with institutions and trying to understand the whole infrastructure, it was just kind of like this beautiful thing, right? Serendipitous that happened. But I would encourage you, and maybe, I don't know if every school has like a outreach person or an office of practice, but that should be the norm in each of the schools on these different campuses. Because I think that's the way, particularly if you're a student that's not from the area or just kind of coming into this institution, you might not know the communities or the organizations that you want to connect with. So I would say first, if there is an office of practice, definitely connect with them. And if not, begin to connect with researchers that you admire that are making those connections with community. Because a part of it is that, again, it's not about kind of using communities as kind of like these, I don't want to say like experiments, but it takes relationship and it takes building trust. And oftentimes that is one of the things that kind of builds this rift between academics and communities, is because either the academics come in and kind of extract and don't ever come back or share what happened, or it's just like a wonderful research question, which might be cool, research and science discovery, I'm totally all for. But if you're really, committed to change and transforming communities, you would want whatever you're doing to be informed by that community. And so sometimes it's just the notion of sitting in on a community meeting, going to a city council meeting and just listening and hearing and seeing, are there some things that with whatever skill set you're bringing that you could help to inform and shape, what a community is going through. I mean, there is no lack of issues in our cities that could benefit from the backing of an institution like University of Michigan and all the skills that I'm sure each of you all have and bring to this space, whether it be environment, justice, et cetera. So I would encourage, kind of those two things. And I'm going to stop now because I know our time is coming to a close.
Yeah, and we have a number of questions in the chat, so we'll quickly just run through some of these to get some of your thoughts. So here's a question in the Q&A from Karina, one of your, it sounds like prior advisors and or colleagues. I know Karina publishes
and advisor.
Yeah, all of the above. And they ask, do you think there's a need to understand the relative importance of the various causes of flooding, as in lack of a sump pump in the area with a high water table, or old weeping tile / home foundation drainage systems, clogged outtakes, city pipes, and others?
Definitely. I mean, there's this assumption, again, and I've been in these conversations, and I won't call names, but there's assumption, and I'm speaking to the city of Detroit, which is what I know, that the cause of these floods are because of the residents either not cleaning out their sewer pipes or not cleaning out their culvert. Like, it's just this blame the individual piece. And so there is such a need to get down, Karina, to what are the actual causes of this flooding, particularly if it's like occurring and reoccurring. Like, you know, after folks have kind of, you know, put in, like a sump pump, or they put in a backflow preventer, you know, even after folks have made kind of these modifications and there's still flooding happening, that is an issue that's beyond them. And so it would be awesome, again, in my dream world, to be able to document where all the flooding happens and really trace back and try and understand, like, what is causing the flooding, you know, because sometimes this flooding happens when it's not that intensive a rain. And then, you know, the issues with combined sewer overflows and all this stuff. So I think there's a definite need for that.
Great. Just going into a few more questions quickly. Victoria Bell's curious, are you doing any research projects in Detroit proper currently?
Oh boy. So Victoria, I just started my new gig about 30 days ago, and I am working on a couple of things. One, crafting something around community health workers and flooding and healthy homes. So that will be something that will be focused in the city of Detroit, and really understanding through quantitative and qualitative data analysis what it means to be a healthy home, and how, again, our infrastructure, both from the housing side and the propensity of flooding that we're seeing, impacts the health of Detroiters, and doing that with, hopefully, in partnership with community health workers in Detroit. So that's one piece. The second project is related to greenhouse gas emissions, but also the justice implications of the transition from auto manufacturing to electrification. So what that means for communities that, and particularly auto workers and communities where these plants have either shut down or transitioning, you know, what are the justice implications of that? The environmental implications, the health implications, the workforce development implications, and what could foster a just transition. And so I am working with MIT and this thing called the Roosevelt Project to really help understand, not only in Detroit, but in the heartland, which are the states of Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, and particularly 6 different cities, what that means and how we can provide policy recommendations and practice recommendations to make sure that these communities, again, receive the benefits of electrification, but also acknowledge the hurt and harm that's been done to the land, water, and air from these auto manufacturing facilities that have, again, ran or been closed down. So that's a couple of things that I'm up to, but I hope to do more now.
Oh, that sounds exciting, and we look forward to learning more about those as they develop. We have a couple of comments related to FEMA flood maps and risk maps, which I think is kind of interesting coming into the Q&A. One person asked, and I'll kind of paraphrase both questions, we can get them together. One asked about your work with the First Street Foundation and the Obama administration's attempts to redevelop the FEMA flood maps. And then the next question looks at the FEMA's risk map program and other flood and RAS products, and can they be a useful tool in combating flooding in vulnerable communities? And how can FEMA, the federal government, or other organizations more broadly improve their data development on flood risk and subsequent outreach to to combat environmental injustices?
Oh my gosh. Okay, how to sum that up in like 30 seconds. So one, FEMA just needs some maps that actually reflect the current situation. the maps, I think, like the comment or the questioner, you know, they're totally outdated, and they're of no use to anyone. So that's the first thing. There needs to be some investments in some good mapping that makes sense. I will also point you to a project that we supported at the foundation through the New School in New York, their urban systems lab, I think USL or something like that. One of the things that I found was a huge barrier was, again, when you talk about all this wonderful climate planning and equitable planning, you know, if you don't have good data, or, you know, whether it's climate data or, you know, historical data around the frequency of rainfall or upsets on CSO systems, it's kind of hard. You can only use the data. Your planning is only going to be as good as the data you have. And if that data is 50 years old, there's no way that's going to be useful to now. So I would say the new school, check out the Urban Systems Lab, because there was actually a project that we're supporting with 3 to 4 cities where they have created this, and I think it might still be in beta testing, but basically this mapping product that gets to the granularity that you need to actually do good planning in cities. Because it's different, water flows differently in a rural area versus a city street. And so you have to have that granularity to really understand, how to plan, where we need to put the green stormwater infrastructure, where we might need some additional gray infrastructure. So I encourage you to check out the new school's Urban Systems Lab. The second organization that, again, because I was like, okay, this is a huge barrier, the Nature Conservancy, and I don't know if it's actually published yet. They might have one paper, and I can share it after, but essentially trying to figure out what are the best ways to create a mapping platform that is usable, reasonable, and affordable for mid to low income cities to help with their climate planning related to flooding, but then also look at other variables, again, demographic, social demographic, things of that nature, to kind of, again, create this vulnerability and kind of prioritize the spaces and places that, again, when you're talking about like financing and state revolving funds and all that stuff, really helping states prioritize where funding needs to be directed. And so the hope was that the Nature Conservancy would kind of do like this rough analysis with flood data and the social demographic data and all these other things that I won't bore you with, to really help with focusing where resources should be deployed. So I would encourage you to check out those 2 opportunities, but it is such a need. It is a gap. Cities can't afford it. I mean, every city is not in LA or New York or whatever. So there needs to be a way to look at that from a planning perspective.
Yeah, and we have time for maybe 1 or 2 other quick questions. I appreciate you rapid fire providing some really thoughtful responses and concisely, which is, we're fitting a lot in, which is just fantastic. Here's one question relating to the implementability concept. Do you have particular recommendations on how to design policies and programs specifically to facilitate implementability?
I know, that's like my made up word. So, I've been having a conversation with a client about this whole concept of implementability that are really at the beginning of their journey in terms of advancing equity across, like internally in their culture, but actually in the core services. So they manage liquid waste, they manage affordable housing, they manage air quality planning and all this stuff. And so one of the ways that I'm starting this conversation is, when I think about implementability, it's really what's easy, medium, and hard. Some things are low-hanging fruit that you can make change quickly at a team level or at a local level. Other things, require additional budget, the okay or the signing off from a city council, or it requires some type of legislation. And so I think when you talk about looking at implementability and then kind of measure that also on the scale of impact, and in this case, we'll talk about equity impact and impact on social equity, I think it's really asking an organization what is important, what are the things, the quick wins that we can maybe get now, and then what are those things that we have to set up ourselves for to get to those things that are more difficult to implement, but could actually get us higher social impact and higher equity. And so I think just going through that process, which again is not rocket science, but not thinking that you're going to save the world in a day, but really being cognizant of what you're able to do, what's in your power, what's in your scope, and what are the things that you can do now versus the things that you can do later. And again, that's where their whole kind of power and privilege and all that conversation comes in, and I don't have time for that. But it's something that I am big on, because I am not for just writing pretty plans and policies and visions and mission statements and not actually doing anything about it. And that is really the goal of my practice, to help folks get over barriers and excuses and reasons as to why we can't do it. Let's make it happen.
Fantastic. I think Rebecca's about to jump in. I think we're out of time for questions. Just as we pass it back to Rebecca and we're about to close out, there are a few we didn't address, so just things to think about moving forward as we leave this meeting. An interesting question about addressing funding gaps in smaller cities, and also the understanding and contextualizing policies within the history of discrimination in which old policies were put in place. So interesting things to think about moving forward, even if we didn't have time to discuss them today.
Awesome.
Rebecca, back to you.
Jordan, you've done a fantastic job of moderating, and I want to thank you for that service to our community today. It's been a pleasure working with you and Tony to host this hour's conversation. And Jalonne, you've given us incredibly visionary, new words, implementability. I love it. I'm going to say it 5 times fast for the rest of the afternoon at intervals. And also just really generous interactive thinking on your feet out loud about what this moment, no matter how ridiculous and distracting the pushback may be, this moment affords us an opportunity to move forward. And it's really exciting to get into the specifics about what your professional trajectory and your very broad matrix of partnerships affords us as tools for that. So thanks for sharing. I know this will be the start and not the end of our conversations with this particular program and institution. And I know that our audience who did not get their questions answered at length will want to know that the talk at the very least will be available on YouTube as an archive with the other lectures in this series very soon on our website at UMSEAS, and that we will be working hard all the time, Tony, myself, Kyle White, and others you mentioned today, to make our curriculum a better and better container for these kinds of conversations. You've brought in a lot of our alumni today, which I want to just shout out about. Nick Bruscato from FEMA, Sarah Hines from USDA. These are folks out there working and listening and bringing their work back to this space to continue learning. And I just think that's wonderful. So Jalonne, huge gratitude and lots of interest to see where your company goes next and how you articulate entirely new models really for addressing these challenges and doing it as communities of engaged scholars and practitioners. Thank you again. Everybody have a great rest of your week. Jalonne, any last word?
No, thank you all so much. And I look forward to engaging and again, just leveling up on all levels. We got a lot of work to do. So appreciate being here. And thank you, Jordan and Dr. Tony and Rebecca for the invite and all that attended. And yeah, looking forward to continue work together.
More soon. Onward, everybody. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you so much.
Bye.